You should know. Here's my contact information if you have any questions. Always happy to answer questions. Usually connect you with other really smart people in our company. But above all, yeah, just feel free to reach out and network. That's one of the great things about conferences, the chance to learn from each other. I actually only came back because last time we had kittens during the presentation. It was definitely a first, and I do appreciate any place where cats are in fact first-class citizens. But we have several pictures from this event with the mother and her kittens running back and forth. I don't remember. I want to say one of them started climbing up somebody. But I don't recall, and I as of now, I don't actually see any kittens running around. It's just a foregone conclusion, by the way. If you're ever looking to give a presentation, just put cats in there. You'll get like 5 stars every time. So why do we have this talk? And I should clarify, there is not one single line of PHP code on any of my slides. So they have me sandwiched very, very nicely between Michael's presentation, which I think had some good theory and some good, and some fun maths. And then we have Nikita, who's coming up after me. And if you're not familiar with Nikita, if you care at all about PHP, absolutely you should be in his talk. But I'm here to talk about something related to everything that we do as PHP developers, right? Because we're in the business of crafting and shaping data and putting that in a meaningful way in front of users. And it is interesting to me that as much as the web has evolved over the last couple of decades, that we find ourselves still solving this problem of getting information to people in the way that they want, in the way that's most meaningful to them. And that is here principle number 1. The web is evolving. How people experience the web is evolving. I mean, the number one thing that has evolved in the last 15 years was a smartphone, changing expectations. People coming to expect to have the web always there on demand. Another thing that I like to bring up when I'm talking about PWA, how many people are familiar with PWA already? Okay, a good, probably about half of you. It is used absolutely. I work for a very big company now, Adobe. And I'm familiar with corporate buzzwords. And yes, PWA, it's not quite as abused as blockchain, but I do hear it used in ways that I think it ought not to be. That said, so if you're coming in here with a PWA bias, believe me, I understand. When I have marketing people talking about PWA, I tend to shut my brain off. But there is actually something there. And we know there's something there because we're watching everything evolve to facilitate PWA. And that's, I think, what makes it this, an eventual and sustainable technology is that the changes that we're making to realize the dream of PWA is, they're incremental. Right, so we're moving progressively, in steps towards this end goal, and I think that these incremental improvements, the really fascinating thing about them is you probably don't notice. Like that's how subtle a lot of this tech is. Right, so PWA, Progressive Web Application. It is progressive because of, and you can go back, there actually was an actual couple, and they were sitting around their table. They're both in the industry, and they We're looking at the things that were happening with JavaScript, the things that were happening with the web, how information was delivered, I think over a nice bottle of Chianti and some dinner. And they decided that there was just one missing piece to really deliver an application-like experience with, via the browser. And so they came up with this term, progressive web app. But fundamentally, underneath, it's the technologies that we know. It's the technologies that we're working with today. That's the web part of it. The application gives us this is kind of the magic, the secret sauce, the shiny element. It is an application-like experience, right? The thing that especially marketers will talk about is, oh my gosh, they can add it to the home screen. Marketers, I think, tend to think of PWA as like that person in the company with, that has 100 users around the world that was just dead certain that instead of a website, they needed a mobile application, right? They needed that mobile app. And they spent a lot of time and money on that mobile app that no one in the end ended up downloading, right? This is, in a way, a solution for that, right? Because with PWA, you do have the ability to add the website to the home screen, and it has an app icon, and it has this app shell. It has this very app-like experience. But fundamentally, it's the web. It's a web browser. That is what PWA is, and I guarantee it. If you're doing anything online, interacting especially with any websites of any size, you're probably encountering bits and pieces of PWA experience already without knowing it. So keep that in mind. The web is evolving, but the fundamentals still matter. I mean, what do? Again, we deliver information. In the early days of the web, this was just a one-way conversation. I have something interesting I want to share. I put it online. Then we began, shortly thereafter, we had the ability to allow users to interact, and we could have sort of a stateful dialogue. The information that we present could then include some context from the user, and then ultimately, as users evolve in sophistication, it becomes all about the experience. So this is the age that we're in right now, where the people that you're creating content for, it really has to fit them to grab their attention. We are in a period of more distraction than I think ever. So let's look at the original mechanism of interactivity, right? It's the form. Fill out some information. Ship this off. Great. Now the web server has some context that we can use. We can either show people some new content. We can blend in the content, the data that they're providing. But this was as dynamic as the web got in the early days. And then it's a lot of young faces here. I'm in my 40s myself. Who remembers Java and Flash? And it feels really strange to say this now that I have an Adobe email address as well, but Adobe has officially announced that they're killing off Flash, finally. Flash was an interesting period, right? Because probably at least a couple people in here spent some time writing ActionScript, right? So you're basically, you were coding for interactivity, you were just doing it inside these walled gardens, right? You were either writing Java applets were nice because they did tend to work everywhere. Flash worked in most places until Apple came along and said, not here. But in the end, it's still not that most common experience that people have, right? The most common frame of reference, the basic set of expectations is how we interact in the browser context, not inside these applets. And then kind of the death of the applets came along as HTML, the spec became more powerful and more capable. We're able to do so much more with CSS, with JavaScript, and just good old markup than we were before. Now, keep in mind, I got my start in this business. If I needed rounded corners for a button, I opened up an image editor, and I created rounded circle and cut it off, slice it, and again, we've come a long way, and this is even not getting us up to the most important development that happened, and that, as I mentioned, was the advent of the smartphone. That really changed everything, right? Because we were used to interacting on the web, these experiences that our users were having, how they experience the work that we do, the content that we create, and then their interaction with that became always on, always in the pocket, always accessible, and how the services that we built around that all had to evolve according to that expectation. Now, interestingly enough, we repeated the same thing again, right? We have the two major smartphone vendors. So you have Android, you have iOS, and you have, along with that, the walled gardens again, right? The app experience. A bit of a detail that just because someone is using your service, and just because your service has an app, you really have to train that user to go for that experience, right? You really have to train them. If I'm buying something online, well, as an American, like if it's a basic commodity, something that I just don't really care where it comes from, like 99% of the time, I'm going through Amazon, right? It's just the easiest thing. I swear they can ship it to me before I even order it. It's a very quick experience, but I know to go into that application. If I'm buying something like a special bottle of wine or a special bottle of whiskey or something like that, and I know that there's a proprietor, some store online that has it, I will go through that store's site to acquire it. But I'm not going to download their app. I don't need their app, right? Part of the reason that that's the case is that my browser on my phone, well, I have two browsers. Well, I have actually like 8 browsers on my phone, but the two that I use mostly, Chrome and Safari, Chrome especially, because that's what I use on my desktop, it knows who I am. It remembers my passwords, it remembers my address information, and most importantly for me, it remembers my payment information. I don't know about you all, but if I'm starting to check out in a browser on my phone and I get to the payment step, I've already found my items, built out my card, everything else, and I get to that part where I have to put in my payment details, and the browser doesn't happen to know the payment details or can't parse that website's checkout form and autofill that stuff for me, I will literally leave and go somewhere else. The net effect may take me longer, but it just bugs me that the capability is out there, but I'm having to repeat myself. I mean, my heart is still very much a developer's. I really don't like to repeat myself. So why is this happening? Well, this is happening in part because Google, they're really the big company behind PWA. At Magento, we started working with them a couple years ago because we figured out this is where front-end development is going. How many of you in here are front-end developers? Okay. How many of you are not willing to admit that you're front-end developers? Front-end development has become very involved. I remember when I was running a development team for an agency, and I had to ask our lead front-end engineer what the workflow involved for front-end development these days, and his first thing was, "Oh, cool, yeah, you just install Node." Like, really? It's not like the tool chain has become complicated. I see some light at the end of the tunnel there, but for us at Magento, we have to figure out, because we make an open source e-commerce software that tries to work everywhere in the world, and that means that we also have to make front-end development workflows, back-end development workflows behave like developers all over the world expect it to behave. And that has become a difficult and fragmented thing. However, with PWA, we see things kind of coming unified again. And that's why we started collaborating with Google on this, because Google are writing the specifications. So when you, if you happen to trust them enough, when you are, basically your browser has personification. It knows who you are. It knows, like I said before, it knows your address. It knows your payment details. It knows other things about you. And this sort of personal representation in that environment, and the fact that it propagates from desktop to tablet to phone, this is happening because Google are literally writing the RFCs. They're setting the standards for this behavior. So what they experiment with and what they find works to their market share then becomes the standard that all browsers should implement. So it's the case that your browsers will increasingly know who you are, and eventually one of the RFCs that they're working on right now is a payments, basically a payments interface. So you'll actually be paying essentially through your browser. I mean, there's some market implications there that make me a little uncomfortable, but that's the idea. That's the idea, is that your browser knows who you are. We no longer need applications, these dedicated applications, in most instances. So I have here a list. We've gone through fits and starts, various attempts to make things that work across multiple contexts. Like if you have an application for your phone, probably you'd need a whole separate tech stack to make that application work on a desktop machine. And we've gone through this, but now it's all obviated by PWA. Apps, even though I say I won't install someone's app like for shopping or anything. Last year, app downloads, 200 billion app downloads. So they are popular, and the concept, the idea that you have this dedicated environment to interact with some source of information, whether it's a news organization, whether it's a shop, is a thing. We're getting better at retaining. I know at Adobe, our experience arm, that's the part that Magento falls under, is collecting like trillions of customer interactions every year. So we're getting some really good insight into what works and what doesn't. And that's, of course, repeated across the whole industry. But at the end of the day, the thing that people know the most is the web, outside of the big, like some of the big marketplaces. And there's a reason for that, right? You've all seen the banner for, you go to a website and it's like, hey, install our app. And then you close it, and then another banner pops up, hey, install our app. And then as you scroll down the page, a little pop-up. Is there a reason you're not installing our app? They have what we call this friction, right? You're going to get taken out of the context you're doing. You're like, man, I'm just trying to buy some toilet paper online, and all of a sudden I've got to go over to the app store for my operating system and download an app, and then I've got to set it up, tell it who I am, log in. Hopefully I can remember my login. But then we have this other problem of the emerging markets, right? So you go into like India, you go into Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, and you're looking at either low bandwidth and poor cellular connectivity in general. I mean, I've been on trains in India doing some conferences, and I can tell you that there's nothing really more frustrating than bringing like a Western expectation into an environment where it's not delivered because of bandwidth. So these are some of the kind of the blockers for apps. The other thing that makes apps really, really difficult are the sheer number of form factors, all of those different phone sizes out there. and the different resolutions. Then there's also the case of like how people expect to interact. If I'm a user and I'm normally interacting with some web property via a nice keyboard, that may not translate as well to an app experience. And so because of this, the web has evolved up until the time of PWA. Responsive web design. This was a relief. This helped us get past the early days of multiple form factors. Being able to break up requests into smaller bits, so you don't have blocking requests like 4 or 8 for every domain. Being able to simultaneously pull a lot of assets. HTTP2 has helped there. And progressive web apps. So the state of the web where we are now is kind of the perfect setup for PWA. What are the main elements of PWA? Well, again, it's so easy to miss what makes PWA good because it seems kind of natural. Probably the biggest outlier is the ability to add to Homescreen. So you see here, this is from the Developer Summit. And in the early days, up until, actually I think, up until more recent versions of iOS, Apple has been kind of sort of way behind Google. Google has been kind of forcing Apple's hand the whole time to implement the things that are necessary that make PWA work. But the ability to add to the home screen, and then you get this app-like icon. And consumers, they don't really feel the difference. If you ask your average consumer who's not probably in our line of business, he or she would say, oh yeah, I've installed the app. But really, all this is, this here that looks like an app, that is nothing more than an app shell with essentially with a browser. That's all it is. And probably, if you're sitting here listening to this, you might realize that a lot of the apps these days, this is essentially what they're doing anyway. So even though you download an app from your app store, you're essentially just interacting with a jailed browser. So that is a fundamental identifier for PWA. The other thing that makes PWA great is that it will do background sync, right? So you have this thing, this little JavaScript friend. You have a service worker. What happens, I'll get to in just a moment, but essentially you have this sort of statefulness that remains, that attaches to really what is a browser experience. And that is also very app-like, very subtle. And another thing that's nice is if I'm multitasking on my phone, which I believe is the entire reason we have phones, that application, that web app, becomes part of it basically behaves like an application when I'm trying to switch between all the things that I'm working on. And then as time has gone on, we've seen the browser vendors implement background sync. So what are the 3 things that you need? And this is to say, actually, I guess I should step aside for a second and say, PWA, essentially, and where front-end development has taken us all, we're at a PHP conference, but we're all doing JavaScript, too. It's really hard to be a web developer these days, regardless of the back-end tech, without touching JavaScript. And this is absolutely the case with PWA. So everything has to be served securely. This is not really an outlier anymore. This is the standard. You provide a manifest, so just simple JSON, right? And this is the thing that specifies, like, if the app shell, what color does it have? This is the thing that specifies origination point. It defines the icon that's going to show there when the user adds it to the home screen. There are lots of other things, but that's the essential stuff. And then it must be able to load up while the phone is offline. And this is, for me, one of the really, this is part of the architecture, part of the spec that, for me, makes PWA its success certain and makes it just a wonderful thing for our industry, right? Because in crafting a PWA experience, you have to think about your information, you have to think about your user experience. You have to think about, okay, I can take the e-commerce example, of course. I'm a user, and I am, now I could be on a train in India. I could be getting on the subway in New York. I still can't believe every time I go to New York and I start going down the escalator or the stairs, and then all of a sudden I'm offline. And that really, when I get that server went away screen on my phone, I'm like, great, now I have to wait until I'm back in Signal. With PWA, you go to the site, and that experience actually allows, through the aggressive fetching, allows for much of the site's functionality to be available. You can even do things like in the more advanced sites, applications, you can add things to cart, you can browse catalog, and ideally, you're just notified if you're down underground. Oh, I'm sorry, you can't check out just yet because you're offline. You get a nice just a little indicator that you're offline. But for the most part, you can and do browse around and use the site like normal. So whether it's a commerce website or you're browsing some news articles, that content, that connectivity is there. And that, I think, is important because what we know is when people enter into a flow where they're going to convert, whether that's reading a news article or adding something to a cart or checking out, but the entire website goes away, you almost always lose that conversion. And so the way this works, though, because there has to be something to answer the user input. And that's what the service worker does. So service workers have a few distinct sort of moments of action. There are things that execute when the web app is being installed. There are things that are executed when you start each time you interact, and the service worker will go out and fetch these surrounding pages around the page that you're on. And we can look at that right now. So here, I did say there was going to be no PHP code, but of course there's just a little bit of JavaScript. So your basic service worker registration here, pretty simple. And the authoritative view on this is developers.google.com. Again, Google are the ones creating this. So first thing you do is you register your service worker, and of course we've also provided the manifest.json, and then then you essentially, whatever you need to do upon installation, you can attach to the install event. And in this case, the standard practice is to just go out and warm up the cache, the local cache, so that the user, if you were to turn off their radio on their phone, they would be none the wiser. Like, I'm clicking from a category page into a product page. Product shows up, I don't know that I'm offline. Again, it's a very easy experience to miss. And then, as the user goes out and continues to work in the app context, you have this fetch event where you can go and attach to do anything else you want to do. It's literally that simple. There's not much to it. For all of the hype and all of the fortunes that are being hung on PWA, there's not much to it. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that one of the things that I really like about PWA is I think the practices that are necessary to make it functional are really good behavior for us all. So Google has a thing called Lighthouse, which hopefully you know about. Because whether you're building a PWA or not, you should be benchmarking your sites with Lighthouse. That absolutely assures that you're doing everything you need to do, everything you should be doing for your users' benefit. So in the case of PWA, all of the links that are followed should resolve. Basically, so any link that you serve someone should be satisfied and resolve with code 200, right? Everything's okay. They should be, it should adapt to any form factor, phone, tablet, and now you can have, as of like Chrome 72, latest version is like 73, you can also install PWA on your desktop. It'll check for cross-browser functionality, and then another important thing is page transitions, right? So your PVA, if I'm going between, two views, it should be instantaneous, right? The application shouldn't pause to figure out its current state of connectivity or anything. It's just immediate, and that actually is afforded to you by the fact that that the service worker has already gone out and warmed up the cache for you. And then also every single page needs its own URL. I've had to update this presentation since even earlier this year. It used to be the case that if you were, as a developer, if you were trying to build a PWA experience, that you had to set certain flags for certain OSs on Chrome. But now, as I mentioned, that has been changed. I think that's been obviated since '72. A couple of sites for reference. What web can do .today. This is a good matrix of the different browser capabilities. There's still a little bit out of sync. There's not quite parity between, like, say, browsers on iOS, browsers on Windows, and browsers on Android. One of the things that I should also point out is Google, in this fight with Apple, because that's exactly what it is an absolute death match. Google is winning. We know they're winning because Apple keeps releasing updates. In fact, the latest 12.2 iOS update gives us even further functionality. So it maintains state. So if I'm on my iPhone and I'm in a PWA and I'm somewhere deep inside, if I left that experience and then came back, essentially the PWA, the app would essentially be restarting. I'd be starting afresh. But that's been fixed since 12.2. Apple still has a little ways to go. Another thing that's happened is Google is making PWAs available and discoverable in the Play Store, in the Android application store. I don't really see Apple doing that anytime soon, if ever. And I can kind of agree that you want to make sure that the apps that you provide are good quality. That said, the nice thing about PWA is it pretty much ensures good quality the whole time. Another thing I should plug, not that I'm here representing any company, but we are investing a tremendous amount of time and effort working to build a PWA authoring experience. And when I say that, I mean, so we're creating essentially the development environment that you should be using, or we think you should be using to build PWA. And not just PWA for Magento, but PWA anywhere. It's it's an environment where essentially you always have, as a developer, in the browser console, you always have the information that you need to find where content is coming from, and also to alert you of anything that's out of order. The Magento community is actually, in general, there's like 3 or 4 PWA projects that are all pretty well subscribed. So if you're interested in how an industry is looking at PWA and implementing it, especially for a big framework, just take a look at what's happening in the Magento space. Yeah. And then also making the business case. I just added this one today. PWA stats is just community curated. It's got bits and pieces of information that you can take to your bosses, or that you can take to your clients and say, okay, well, the PWA, Trivago did this and bookings increased 150%, or basically user attachment did this. The numbers out there are very good, and the what's required to implement it is very small. So, in summary, PWA, it's a bit different, right? Because we have this new offline experience. But it's not really that different, because all we're trying to do with that offline experience is make people sort of not realize that they're offline. It's not always obvious, right? You can have a PWA experience and not realize it entirely. And this even can start with AMP, which I think we have. There are philosophical objections to AMP. I get it. But if you've ever noticed, like, you can search for something in Google, and then in the results actually see category listings or product page, click into that, and then you're in this AMP sort of cached page, and then you can actually seamlessly move from there into a PWA experience. And as I mentioned, there are some limitations, but those are fewer and fewer about every 6 months as operating systems are updated and as the RFCs are completed and adopted. It is, in fact, is very much the case that that the PWA will not be this ancillary thing that you're putting onto your web projects in the coming years. It's just natural. It'll be there, just like all the test coverage that we build into our applications without fail. So that is your intro into PWA, and then I'll leave you again with just 3 requirements: serve securely, provide a manifest, and then implement the service worker. All you have to do is register the service worker, provide some instructions to pre-cache, and then do whatever else you want. Those are your events. The architecture is dead simple. If you're working with something like Symfony, there are Symfony PWA packages, right, that you can bolt onto your application just with a little composer require to start playing with it. And that it's also the case for the other frameworks as well. So I encourage you, if you're not playing with it now, you really should, because this is where the web is headed. Any questions or comments? Yeah, let's wait for the mic. By the way, you'll notice that everything I do is a little orange. It's a Magento thing. I normally don't wear bright tennis shoes.
First, hello, and thanks for coming from a long, long way. And my question is that how do you get to 100 from all of your HTTP requests? I couldn't quite catch that part.
Good question. Well, it's my pleasure. I have you to thank, actually, for introducing me to Turkish baklava, and I will go on record. It is better than anything I've ever had in Greece. And then, by the way, Tracy told me I'm not allowed to bring home any Turkish delight. She's on a diet. Yeah. So the 200. So essentially, what you've done, it is a good question. The 200 response is for all of the URLs that that you're providing. So anything that's being cached and the links that are inside there. The expectation is if you're providing a true offline experience, right? The expectation is that I'm not going to click on a link and have it, 404. Or me see a notice that the server's gone away. So you have to handle. It depends on your information architecture. It depends on what you're serving. But basically, you need to the user needs to be aware they either need to get the content that link should provide them, or if that link is to something that really requires statefulness to be meaningful, like some awareness of something that's happening at the server level, you just need to provide the information that, like, oh, yep, sorry, this is incomplete or unavailable because you're currently offline. Yep, exactly. Yeah, it's a good question, but it's also this is the stuff that's really challenging for us, because we look at this and we're like, okay, now we're introducing a whole new dimension to our workflow, like to the things that we have to consider. Like I get on the subway, so I'm down there, I'm offline, I've added something to the cart, checkout, right? Especially once this capability comes along. Then maybe we'll just say, my phone dies or whatever, right? So it stays offline. I go home like, oh yeah, I needed to buy that thing. So I go online, I buy the thing, like from my laptop or my tablet, and then plug my phone in, and my browser, syncs up. All of a sudden I've got 2 orders. Very basic example, but this is just a whole new dimension that we have to consider, that our users are actually going to be interacting with our property, but they're going to be interacting in a local scope, right? It's just an interesting thing to consider. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. TNGT. Anyone have any guesses? Yeah, I was hoping we were going to go for some ninja, like, green turtles. Nope, it's just the next greatest thing. That's one I'll use internally. We have a lot of meetings. It's a big company. There's like 20,000 people at Adobe, and I like to cut through the bullshit. I don't have time for it.
Okay, so one major difference between web applications and native applications is that native applications are presented an API to actually have access to the whole system, pretty much.
Right.
So we do see emergence of APIs for quite a lot of stuff, but for example, I still don't know, I believe there is no web API for me to turn on my flashlight.
Yeah.
So the question that I have is there some chance that we'll get some sort of a specification that will allow manufacturers to expose APIs to specific devices, something like web drivers or something?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. I have Magento stickers that I can give away, but you don't even have to ask a question. But it's a good question. It's definitely worth a sticker. Yeah, so like right now in iOS, it's not possible. Like, so one of the things that we have, again with Magento, is one of the things that I lord over is our innovation lab, right? So we have basically every couple of months we have a cohort where people submit their innovations. And these can't be like products or services that are out there. They just have to be like raw, like what cool stuff are you doing with Magento, and like throwing Magento against. And so these days we're getting a lot of like our current innovation lab winners are like people who have, for example, like you walk into a store, you're on your phone, you're in their app, and you put in a product, right? And then the phone will literally will light up the path through the store to get you to that product on the shelf. Or there are also AR apps for fitment. So of course you have AR where you basically you pull something off like out of off the page, off the product page, and then you can, like, it's a chair, and then I can actually just like have edge detection in my browser, and Safari will find the edges in a room that I'm in, and then I can actually place that product in the room, and it even draws shadow and everything. I mean, it's pretty remarkable, right? So these kinds of experiences, the reason I had that long preamble is because these kinds of experiences are also going to become the new normal for consumers, right? And again, it's not just commerce. I mean, it could also be like how you experience news or any other number of things. And so your question is actually is really important, which is like how do we do this? Now we have precedent for this, right? Because you have PhoneGap. You have other like essentially JavaScript libraries that were shims that could provide some level of hardware access for a browser experience. It's a
bit hacky though.
Sorry?
A bit hacky though. It's hackish, but
excuse me, exactly. So it's not, it's not ideal. Ideally, it's the vendors themselves that are doing this. But the thing is, they're going to have to do this because this is what drives this whole party, right? How we got from text and a picture and maybe a MIDI file on a screen in '99 to where we are today is we just do this to our users all the time. We test, we implement, we build the new stuff, we give it to them, and then they're like, wow, this is amazing. 3 months later, it's like everyone else has copied that, and that's become the new normal. This is what we do to consumers and customers and users again and again and again. It's okay. It's a good thing. It keeps this whole job interesting, right? Because we're always progressing. Currently, depending on the environment you're working in, like Android can do more than iPhone in terms of giving access to some functions. Like, let's see. If I were to, let me see, am I mirroring? Perfect. Actually, I was just looking at this. Yeah. So. Here's the latest for iOS 12.2. So this is the latest kind of major version out for iOS. I think in here, do we have? Yes. So you can access camera, but but not a whole lot of other things, right? So there are. The browser vendors, it's my contention, again, just based on needing to keep users, they want to keep users locked into their ecosystem, and that means providing the functionality that users expect. And right now we talk about AR, I talk about like, my wife holding, I'm shopping for a blazer, my wife basically can measure me, and that can give me good fitment on a website, right? That seems pretty kind of far out there right now. But it's happening. It's literally happening today, and it's going to become the normal going forward.
So your opinion is it's more than reasonable to expect this to emerge at some point.
Yeah, I think you're gonna see what is currently a blurring line between browser and sort of native app is going to essentially disappear. I mean, there may be some things that aren't exposed to browser via API, but I think eventually most of the functionality will move there. I mean, if nothing else, then because we have kind of JavaScript underpinning this whole thing, and Atwood said it would be the case. Anything that can be written in JavaScript will be written in JavaScript.
Okay, thanks.
And anything that can be enabled by JavaScript will be enabled by JavaScript. Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? One here in the middle. Yes, so the question is, for the camera, the question is, with ever-improving connectivity, going from 4G to 5G, and maybe one day we'll have 6Gs, that, doesn't this kind of make PWA unnecessary? I don't know about you, but there are plenty of well, so there's a big difference from Western expectations, like modern infrastructure. Like here, I'm gonna be annoyed as shit if I walk down the street and I don't have a signal. Like it's gonna be a frustrating experience for me. Now I can go deep into a building and lose connectivity, but those are few and far between. But there are plenty of places throughout the world where connectivity, even though there's a cellular network, even the handoff as you go from cell to cell, this is very true in India, right? As you're getting handed off from one cell to the next, you actually will lose that continuous connectivity. But I think there will remain plenty of cases where offline is necessary. Now, as we look out and we look at we look at satellites being deployed, for total circumference coverage of the globe, right? That's interesting. The speeds eventually would probably increase as well. But for the time being, this is really good tech. But it's also not just about the offline. I mean, the offline is a requirement, but the things that you do to make these fast and nimble, like the how you trim the data that you're serving, that is what makes. That's also a big driver for this technology, because it actually just makes websites more nimble and happier. And I think that's probably time for me. Yes. So I want to thank each and every one of you for hanging out with me and talking about the future of web and stuff. And I'll be around directly afterwards if you want to chat further. Thank you.